The Khazars were a semi-nomadic Turkic people with a confederation of Turkic tribes that in the late 6th century CE established a major commercial empire covering the southeastern section of modern European Russia, southern Ukraine, Crimea, and Kazakhstan. The Caspian Sea is still called the Khazar Sea in some local languages such as Azerbaijani or Crimean Tatar. The Khazars created what for its duration was the most powerful polity to emerge from the breakup of the Western Turkic Khaganate. Astride a major artery of commerce between Eastern Europe and Southwestern Asia, Khazaria became one of the foremost trading empires of the medieval world, commanding the western marches of the Silk Road and playing a key commercial role as a crossroad between China, the Middle East and Kievan Rus. For some 3 centuries the Khazars dominated the vast area extending from the Volga-Don steppes to the eastern Crimea and the northern Caucasus. Khazaria long served as a buffer state between the Byzantine Empire and both the nomads of the northern steppes and the Umayyad Caliphate and Abbasid Caliphate, after serving as the Byzantine Empire's proxy against the Sasanian Empire. The alliance was dropped around 900. Byzantium began to encourage the Alans to attack Khazaria and to weaken its hold on Crimea and the Caucasus and sought to obtain an entente with the rising Rus power to the north, which it aspired to convert to Christianity. Between 965 and 969, the Kievan Rus ruler, Sviatoslav I of Kiev, as well as his allies, conquered the capital, Atil, and ended Khazaria's independence. The state became the autonomous entity of Rus and then of Khazar former provinces in Volga, Bulgaria. Determining the origins and nature of the Khazars is closely bound with theories of their languages, but it is a matter of intricate difficulty since no indigenous records in the Khazar language survive, and the state was polyglot and polyethnic. The native religion of the Khazars is thought to have been Tengrism, like that of the North Caucasian Huns and other Turkic peoples. The polyethnic populace of the Khazar Khaganate appears to have been a multi-confessional mosaic of pagan, Tengrist, Jewish, Christian and Muslim worshippers. Some of the Khazars joined the ancient Hungarians in the 9th century. The ruling elite of the Khazars was said by Judah Halevi and Abraham ibn Daud to have converted to Rabbinic Judaism in the 8th century, but the scope of the conversion to Judaism within the Khazar Khanate remains uncertain. Proposals of Khazar origins have been made regarding the Hungarians, the Cossacks of the Don region and of Ukraine, Bukharan Jews, the Muslim Khmyks, the Turkic-speaking Crimeshaks and their Crimean neighbors the Crimean Karaites, the Moldavian Shangos, the Mountain Jews, even some Subbotniks on the basis of their Ukrainian and Cossack origin and others. The late 19th century saw the emergence of the theory that the core of today's Ashkenazi Jews are descended from a hypothetical Khazarian Jewish diaspora which migrated westward from modern-day Russia and Ukraine into modern-day France and Germany. Linguistic and genetic studies have not supported the theory of a Khazar connection to Ashkenazi Jewry. The theory still finds occasional support, but most scholars view it with considerable skepticism. The theory is sometimes associated with antisemitism and anti-Zionism. History. Tribal origins and early history. The tribes that were to comprise the Khazar Empire were not an ethnic union, but a congeries of steppe nomads and peoples who came to be subordinated, and subscribed to a core Turkic leadership. Many Turkic groups, such as the Oghuric peoples, including Saragurs, Ogurs, Onagurs, and Bulgars who earlier formed part of the TL Confederation, are attested quite early, having been driven west by the Sabirs, who in turn fled the Asian Avars, and began to flow into the Volga-Caspian Pontic zone from as early as the 4th century CE and are recorded by Priscus to reside in the western Eurasian steppe lands as early as 463. They appear to stem from Mongolia and South Siberia in the aftermath of the fall of the Hunnic/Xiongnu nomadic polities. A variegated tribal federation led by these Turks, probably comprising a complex assortment of Iranian, Proto-Mongolic, Uralic, and Paleo-Siberian clans, vanquished the Rouran Khaganate of the hegemonic Central Asian Avars in 552 and swept westwards, taking in their train other steppe nomads and peoples from Sogdiana. The ruling family of this confederation may have hailed from the Ashina clan of the West Turkic tribes, although Konstantin Zuckerman regards Ashina and their pivotal role in the formation of the Khazars with skepticism. Golden notes that Chinese and Arabic reports are almost identical, making the connection a strong one, and conjectures that their leader may have been Yipishekui, who lost power or was killed around 651. Moving west, the confederation reached the land of the Akatsaroi, who had been important allies of Byzantium in fighting off Attila's army. Rise of the Khazar state. An embryonic state of Khazariya began to form sometime after 630, when it emerged from the breakdown of the larger Göktürk Khaganate. Göktürk armies had penetrated the Volga by 549, ejecting the Avars, who were then forced to flee to the sanctuary of the Hungarian plain. The Ashina clan, whose tribal name was Turk, appear on the scene by 552, when they overthrew the Rurans and established the Göktürk Khaganate. By 568, these Göktürks were probing for an alliance with Byzantium to attack Persia. An internecine war broke out between the senior Eastern Göktürks and the junior West Turkic Khaganate some decades later, when on the death of Taspir Khagan, a succession dispute led to a dynastic crisis between Taspir's chosen heir, the Apa Khagan, and the ruler appointed by the tribal high council, Ashina Shetu, the Ishbara Khagan. By the first decades of the 7th century, the Ashina Yabgutong managed to stabilize the Western division, but upon his death, after providing crucial military assistance to Byzantium and routing the Sasanian army in the Persian heartland, the Western Turkic Khaganate dissolved under pressure from the encroaching Tang dynasty armies and split into two competing federations, each consisting of 5 tribes, collectively known as the 10 Arrows. Both briefly challenged Tang hegemony in eastern Turkestan. To the west, 2 new nomadic states arose in the meantime: Old Great Bulgaria under Kubrat, the Dualu clan leader, and the Nushibi subconfederation, also consisting of 5 tribes. The Dualu challenged the Avars in the Kuban River Sea of Azov area, while the Khazar Khaganate consolidated further westwards, led apparently by an Ashina dynasty. With a resounding victory over the tribes in 657, engineered by General Su Dingfang, Chinese overlordship was imposed to their east after a final mop-up operation in 659. But the two confederations of Bulgars and Khazars fought for supremacy on the western steppeland, and with the ascendancy of the latter, the former either succumbed to Khazar rule or, as under Asparuk, Kubrat's son, shifted even further west across the Danube to lay the foundations of the First Bulgarian Empire in the Balkans. The Khaganate of the Khazars thus took shape out of the ruins of this nomadic empire as it broke up under pressure from the Tang dynasty armies to the east sometime between 630 and 650. After their conquest of the lower Volga region to the east and an area westwards between the Danube and the Dnieper, and their subjugation of the Onogar-Bulgar Union, sometime around 670, a properly constituted Khazar Khaganate emerges, becoming the westernmost successor state of the formidable Göktürk Khaganate after its disintegration. According to Omlyan Pritsik, the language of the Onogar-Bulgar Federation was to become the lingua franca of Khazariya as it developed into what Lev Gumilev called the Steppe Atlantis. Historians have often referred to this period of Khazar domination as the Pax Khazarica, since the state became an international trading hub permitting Western Eurasian merchants safe transit across it to pursue their business without interference. The high status soon to be accorded this empire to the north is attested by Ibn al-Balhi's Farsnama, which relates that the Sasanian Shah, Huzra I, Aenusirvan, placed 3 thrones by his own, one for the king of China, a second for the king of Byzantium, and a third for the king of the Khazars. Although anachronistic and retrodating the Khazars to this period, the legend, in placing the Khazar Khagan on a throne with equal status to kings of the other 2 superpowers, bears witness to the reputation won by the Khazars from early times. Khazar state, culture and institutions. Royal diarchy with sacral Khaganate. Khazariya developed a dual kingship governance structure, typical among Turkic nomads, consisting of a Shad/Bak and a Khagan. The emergence of this system may be deeply entwined with the conversion to Judaism. According to Arabic sources, the lesser king was called Isa and the greater king Khazar Zakhan. The former managed and commanded the military, while the greater king's role was primarily sacral, less concerned with daily affairs. The greater king was recruited from the Khazar house of notables and, in an initiation ritual, was nearly strangled until he declared the number of years he wished to reign, on the expiration of which he would be killed by the nobles. The deputy ruler would enter the presence of the reclusive greater king only with great ceremony, approaching him barefoot to prostrate himself in the dust and then light a piece of wood as a purifying fire, while waiting humbly and calmly to be summoned. Particularly elaborate rituals accompanied a royal burial. At one period, travelers had to dismount, bow before the ruler's tomb, and then walk away on foot. Subsequently, the charismatic sovereign's burial place was hidden from view, with a palatial structure constructed and then hidden under rerouted river water to avoid disturbance by evil spirits and later generations. Such a royal burial ground is typical of Inner Asian peoples. Both the Isa and the Zakhan converted to Judaism sometime in the 8th century, while the rest, according to the Persian traveler Ahmad ibn Rusta, probably followed the old Turkic religion. Ruling elite. The ruling stratum, like that of the later Senghisids within the Golden Horde, was a relatively small group that differed ethnically and linguistically from its subject peoples, meaning the Alanoas and Oghuric Turkic tribes, who were numerically superior within Khazaria. The Khazar Khagans, while taking wives and concubines from the subject populations, were protected by a Khwarezmian guard corps, or comitatus, called the Ursiya. But unlike many other local polities, they hired soldiers. At the peak of their empire, the Khazars ran a centralized fiscal administration, with a standing army of some 7,000 to 12,000 men, which could, at need, be multiplied 2 or 3 times that number by inducting reserves from their nobles' retinues. Other figures for the permanent standing army indicate that it numbered as many as 100,000. They controlled and exacted tribute from 25 to 30 different nations and tribes inhabiting the vast territories between the Caucasus, the Aral Sea, the Ural Mountains, and the Ukrainian steppes. Khazar armies were led by the Khagan Bek and commanded by subordinate officers known as Tarkans. When the Bek sent out a body of troops, they would not retreat under any circumstances. If they were defeated, everyone who returned was killed. Settlements were governed by administrative officials known as Tuduns. In some cases, such as the Byzantine settlements in southern Crimea, a Tudun would be appointed for a town nominally within another polity's sphere of influence. Other officials in the Khazar government included dignitaries referred to by Ibn Fadlan as Jah Shigar and Kunar, but their responsibilities are unknown. Demographics. It has been estimated that from 25 to 28 distinct ethnic groups made up the population of the Khazar Khaganate, aside from the ethnic elite. The ruling elite seems to have been constituted out of 9 tribes/clans, themselves ethnically heterogeneous, spread over perhaps 9 provinces or principalities, each of which would have been allocated to a clan. In terms of caste or class, some evidence suggests that there was a distinction, whether racial or social is unclear, between white Khazars and black Khazars. The 10th century Muslim geographer al-Istakri claimed that the white Khazars were strikingly handsome with reddish hair, white skin, and blue eyes, while the black Khazars were swarthy, verging on deep black, as if they were some kind of Indian. Many Turkic nations had a similar division between a white ruling warrior caste and a black class of commoners. The consensus among mainstream scholars is that Istakri was confused by the names given to the two groups. However, Khazars are generally described by early Arab sources as having a white complexion, blue eyes, and reddish hair. The ethnonym in the Tang Chinese annals, Ashina, often accorded a key role in the Khazar leadership, may reflect an Eastern Iranian or Tocharian word, Middle Persian Aksina, Tochariana Asena. The distinction appears to have survived the collapse of the Khazarian Empire. Later Russian chronicles, commenting on the role of the Khazars in the Magyarization of Hungary, refer to them as white ogres and Magyars as black ogres. Studies of the physical remains, such as skulls at Sarkel, have revealed a mixture of Slavic, other European, and a few Mongolian types. Economy. The import and export of foreign wares, and the revenues derived from taxing their transit, was a hallmark of the Khazar economy, although it is said also to have produced isinglass. Distinctively among the nomadic steppe polities, the Khazar Khaganate developed a self-sufficient domestic Saltovo economy, a combination of traditional pastoralism, allowing sheep and cattle to be exported, extensive agriculture, abundant use of the Volga's rich fishing stocks, together with craft manufacture, with a diversification and lucrative returns from taxing international trade given its pivotal control of major trade routes. The Khazars constituted one of the 2 great furnishers of slaves to the Muslim market, supplying it with captured Slavs and tribesmen from the Eurasian Northlands. It was profits from the latter which enabled it to maintain a standing army of Kraim Muslim troops. The capital Atil reflected the division, Karazhan on the western bank where the king and his Khazar elite, with a retinue of some 4,000 attendants, dwelt, and Idle proper to the east, inhabited by Jews, Christians, Muslims and slaves and by craftsmen and foreign merchants. The ruling elite wintered in the city and spent from spring to late autumn in their fields. A large irrigated green belt, drawing on channels from the Volga River, lay outside the capital, where meadows and vineyards extended for some 20 farsakhs. While customs duties were imposed on traders, and tribute and tithes were exacted from 25 to 30 tribes, with a levy of 1 sable skin, squirrel pelt, sword, dirham per hearth or plowshare, or hides, wax, honey and livestock, depending on the zone. Trade disputes were handled by a commercial tribunal and a teal consisting of 7 judges, 2 for each of the monotheistic inhabitants and 1 for the pagans. Khazars and Byzantium. Byzantine diplomatic policy towards the steppe peoples generally consisted of encouraging them to fight among themselves. The Pechenegs provided great assistance to the Byzantines in the 9th century in exchange for regular payments. Byzantium also sought alliances with the Gokturks against common enemies. In the early 7th century, one such alliance was brokered with the Western Turks against the Persian Sasanians in the Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602–628. The Byzantines called Khazariya Turkiya, and by the 9th century referred to the Khazars as Turks. During the period leading up to and after the siege of Constantinople in 626, Heraclius sought help via emissaries, and eventually personally, from a Gokturk chieftain of the Western Turkic Khaganate, Tong Yabhu Khagan, in Tiflis, plying him with gifts and the promise of marriage to his daughter, Epiphania. Tong Yabhu responded by sending a large force to ravage the Persian Empire, marking the start of the Third Perso-Turkic War. A joint Byzantine-Turk operation breached the Caspian Gates and sacked Derbent in 627. Together they then besieged Tiflis, where the Byzantines may have deployed an early variety of traction trebuchets to breach the walls. After the campaign, Tong Yabhu is reported, perhaps with some exaggeration, to have left some 40,000 troops behind with Heraclius. Although occasionally identified with Khazars, the Gokturk identification is more probable since the Khazars only emerged from that group after the fragmentation of the former sometime after 630. Some scholars argued that Sasanian Persia never recovered from the devastating defeat wrought by this invasion. Once the Khazars emerged as a power, the Byzantines also began to form alliances with them, dynastic and military. In 695, the last Heraclian emperor, Justinian II, nicknamed the Slit-Nosed after he was mutilated and deposed, was exiled to Kherson in the Crimea, where a Khazar governor presided. He escaped into Khazar territory in 704 or 705 and was given asylum by Khagan Bizerglavan, who gave him his sister in marriage, perhaps in response to an offer by Justinian, who may have thought a dynastic marriage would seal by kinship a powerful tribal support for his attempts to regain the throne. The Khazarian spouse thereupon changed her name to Theodora. Bizer was offered a bribe by the Byzantine usurper, Tiberius III, to kill Justinian. Warned by Theodora, Justinian escaped, murdering 2 Khazar officials in the process. He fled to Bulgaria, whose Khan Tervel helped him regain the throne. Upon his reinstallment, and despite Bizer's treachery during his exile, he sent for Theodora. Bizer complied, and she was crowned as Augusta, suggesting that both prized the alliance. Decades later, Leo III made a similar alliance to coordinate strategy against a common enemy, the Muslim Arabs. He sent an embassy to the Khazar Khagan Bihar and married his son, the future Constantine V, to Bihar's daughter, a princess referred to as Tsitsak, in 732. On converting to Christianity, she took the name Irene. Constantine and Irene had a son, the future Leo IV, who thereafter bore the sobriquet, the Khazar. Leo died in mysterious circumstances after his Athenian wife bore him a son, Constantine VI, who on his majority co-ruled with his mother, the Dowager. He proved unpopular, and his death ended the dynastic link of the Khazars to the Byzantine throne. By the 8th century, Khazars dominated the Crimea, and even extended their influence into the Byzantine peninsula of Kherson until it was wrested back in the 10th century. Khazar and Farganian mercenaries constituted part of the Imperial Byzantine Hetaria bodyguard after its formation in 840, a position that could openly be purchased by a payment of £7 of gold. Arab-Khazar Wars. During the 7th and 8th centuries, the Khazars fought a series of wars against the Umayyad Caliphate and its Abbasid successor. The First Arab-Khazar War began during the first phase of Muslim expansion. By 640, Muslim forces had reached Armenia. In 642 they launched their first raid across the Caucasus under Abd ar-Rahman ibn Rabia. In 652 Arab forces advanced on the Khazar capital, Balanjar, but were defeated, suffering heavy losses. According to Persian historians such as al-Tabari, both sides in the battle used catapults against the opposing troops. A number of Russian sources give the name of a Khazar Kagan from this period as Urbis and describe him as a scion of the Göktürk royal house, the Ashina. Whether Urbis ever existed is open to debate, as is whether he can be identified with one of the many Göktürk rulers of the same name. Due to the outbreak of the First Muslim Civil War and other priorities, the Arabs refrained from repeating an attack on the Khazars until the early 8th century. The Khazars launched a few raids into Transcaucasian principalities under Muslim dominion, including a large-scale raid in 683 to 685 during the Second Muslim Civil War that rendered much booty and many prisoners. There is evidence from the account of al-Tabari that the Khazars formed a united front with the remnants of the Göktürks in Transoxiana. The Second Arab-Khazar War began with a series of raids across the Caucasus in the early 8th century. The Umayyads tightened their grip on Armenia in 705 after suppressing a large-scale rebellion. In 713 or 714, Umayyad general Mayslama conquered Derbent and drove deeper into Khazar territory. The Khazars launched raids in response into Albania and Iranian Azerbaijan but were driven back by the Arabs under Hassan ibn al-Numan. The conflict escalated in 722 with an invasion by 30,000 Khazars into Armenia, inflicting a crushing defeat. Caliph Yazid II responded, sending 25,000 Arab troops north, swiftly driving the Khazars back across the Caucasus, recovering Derbent, and advancing on Balanjar. The Arabs broke through the Khazar defense and stormed the city. Most of its inhabitants were killed or enslaved, but a few managed to flee north. Despite their success, the Arabs had not yet defeated the Khazar army, and they retreated south of the Caucasus. In 724, Arab general al-Jarrah ibn Abdallah al-Hakami inflicted a crushing defeat on the Khazars in a long battle between the rivers Cyrus and Arashas, then moved on to capture Tiflis, bringing Caucasian Iberia under Muslim suzerainty. The Khazars struck back in 726, led by a prince named Barjik, launching a major invasion of Albania and Azerbaijan. By 729, the Arabs had lost control of northeastern Transcaucasia and were thrust again into the defensive. In 730, Barjik invaded Iranian Azerbaijan and defeated Arab forces at Ardabil, killing the general al-Diyara al-Hakami and briefly occupying the town. Barjik was defeated and killed the next year at Mosul, where he directed Khazar forces from a throne mounted with al-Diyara's severed head. In 737, Marwan ibn Muhammad entered Khazar territory under the guise of seeking a truce. He then launched a surprise attack in which the Khagan fled north and the Khazars surrendered. The Arabs did not have resources to influence affairs of Transcaucasia. The Khagan was forced to accept terms involving conversion to Islam, and to subject himself to the caliphate, but the accommodation was short-lived as a combination of internal instability among the Umayyads and Byzantine support undid the agreement within 3 years, and the Khazars reasserted their independence. The suggestion that the Khazars adopted Judaism as early as 740 is based on the idea that, in part, it was a reassertion of independence with regard to both Byzantium and the Caliphate, while conforming to a general Eurasian trend to embrace a world religion. Whatever the impact of Marwan's campaigns, warfare between the Khazars and the Arabs ceased for more than 2 decades after 737. Arab raids continued until 741. But their control in the region was limited as maintaining a large garrison at Derbent further depleted the already overstretched army. A third Muslim civil war soon broke out, leading to the Abbasid Revolution and the fall of the Umayyad dynasty in 750. In 758, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur attempted to strengthen diplomatic ties with the Khazars, ordering Yazid ibn Usaid al-Sulami, one of his nobles and the military governor of Armenia, to take a royal Khazar bride. Yazid married a daughter of Khazar Kagan Bagadar, but she died inexplicably, possibly in childbirth. Her attendants returned home, convinced that some Arab faction had poisoned her, and her father was enraged. Khazar general Raz Tarkan invaded south of the Caucasus in 762 to 764, devastating Albania, Armenia, and Iberia, and capturing Tiflis. Thereafter relations became increasingly cordial between the Khazars and the Abbasids, whose foreign policies were generally less expansionist than the Umayyads, broken only by a series of raids in 799 over another failed marriage alliance. Khazars and Hungarians. Around 830, a rebellion broke out in the Khazar Khaganate. As a result, 3 Khabar tribes of the Khazars joined the Hungarians and moved through Levadia to what the Hungarians call the Etelkos, the territory between the Carpathians and the Dnieper River. The Hungarians faced their first attack by the Pechenegs around 854, though other sources state that an attack by Pechenegs was the reason for their departure to Etelkos. The new neighbors of the Hungarians were the Varangians and the Eastern Slavs. From 862 onwards, the Hungarians along with their allies, the Khazars, started a series of raids from the Etelkos into the Carpathian Basin, mostly against the Eastern Frankish Empire and Great Moravia, but also against the Lower Pannonian Principality and Bulgaria. Then they together ended up at the outer slopes of Carpathians, and settled there, where the majority of Khazars converted from Judaism to Christianity in the 10th to 13th centuries. There could be shamanists and Christians among these Khazars apart from Jews. Rise of the Rus and the collapse of the Khazarian state. By the 9th century, groups of Varangian Rus, developing a powerful warrior merchant system, began probing south down the waterways controlled by the Khazars and their protectorate, the Volga Bulgarians, partially in pursuit of the Arab silver that flowed north for hoarding through the Khazarian Volga-Bulgarian trading zones, partially to trade in furs and ironwork. Northern mercantile fleets passing Atil were tithed, as they were at Byzantine Kherson. Their presence may have prompted the formation of a Rus state by convincing the Slavs, Maria and the Chud to unite to protect common interests against Khazarian exactions of tribute. It is often argued that a Rus Khaganate modeled on the Khazarian state had formed to the east, and that the Varangian chieftain of the coalition appropriated the title of Khagan as early as the 830s. The title survived to denote the princes of Kievan Rus, whose capital, Kiev, is often associated with the Khazarian foundation. The construction of the Sarkal fortress, with technical assistance from Khazaria's Byzantine ally at the time, together with the minting of an autonomous Khazar coinage around the 830s, may have been a defensive measure against emerging threats from Varangians to the north and from the Magyars on the eastern steppe. By 860, the Rus had penetrated as far as Kiev and, via the Dnieper, Constantinople. Alliances often shifted. Byzantium, threatened by Varangian Rus raiders, would assist Khazaria, and Khazaria at times allowed the northerners to pass through their territory in exchange for a portion of the booty. From the beginning of the 10th century, the Khazars found themselves fighting on multiple fronts as nomadic incursions were exacerbated by uprisings by former clients and invasions from former allies. The Pax Khazarica was caught in a pincer movement between steppe Pechenegs and the strengthening of an emergent Rus power to the north, both undermining Khazaria's tributary empire. According to the Schechter text, the Khazar ruler King Benjamin fought a battle against the allied forces of 5 lands whose moves were perhaps encouraged by Byzantium. Although Benjamin was victorious, his son Aaron too faced another invasion, this time led by the Alans, whose leader had converted to Christianity and entered into an alliance with Byzantium, which, under Leo VI the Wise, encouraged them to fight against the Khazars. By the 880s, Khazar control of the Middle Dnieper from Kiev, where they collected tribute from Eastern Slavic tribes, began to wane as Oleg of Novgorod wrested control of the city from the Varangian warlords Askold and Dir, and embarked on what was to prove to be the foundation of a Rus empire. The Khazars had initially allowed the Rus to use the trade route along the Volga River, and raid southwards. See Caspian expeditions of the Rus. According to Al-Masudi, the Khagan is said to have given his assent on the condition that the Rus give him half of the booty. In 913, however, 2 years after Byzantium concluded a peace treaty with the Rus in 911, a Varangian foray, with Khazar connivance, through Arab lands led to a request to the Khazar throne by the Khwarezmi Islamic Guard for permission to retaliate against the large Rus contingent on its return. The purpose was to revenge the violence the Rus razzias had inflicted on their fellow Muslim believers. The Rus force was thoroughly routed and massacred. The Khazar rulers closed the passage down the Volga to the Rus, sparking a war. In the early 960s, Khazar ruler Joseph wrote to Hasdai ibn Shaprut about the deterioration of Khazar relations with the Rus. I protect the mouth of the river and prevent the Rus arriving in their ships from setting off by sea against the Ishmaelites and all enemies from setting off by land to Bab. The Rus warlords launched several wars against the Khazar Khaganate, and raided down to the Caspian Sea. The Schechter letter relates the story of a campaign against Khazaria by HLGW around 941 in which Oleg was defeated by the Khazar general Pasek. The Khazar alliance with the Byzantine Empire began to collapse in the early 10th century. Byzantine and Khazar forces may have clashed in the Crimea, and by the 940s Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus was speculating into Administrando Imperio about ways in which the Khazars could be isolated and attacked. The Byzantines during the same period began to attempt alliances with the Pechenegs and the Rus, with varying degrees of success. Sviatoslav I finally succeeded in destroying Khazar imperial power in the 960s, in a circular sweep that overwhelmed Khazar fortresses like Sarkal and Tamatarka, and reached as far as the Caucasian Kasachans/Circassians and then back to Kiev. Sarkal fell in 965, with the capital city of Atil following, circa 968 or 969. In the Russian chronicle, the vanquishing of the Khazar traditions is associated with Vladimir's conversion in 986. According to the primary chronicle, in 986 Khazar Jews were present at Vladimir's disputation to decide on the prospective religion of the Kievan Rus. Whether these were Jews who had settled in Kiev or emissaries from some Jewish Khazar remnant state is unclear. Conversion to one of the faiths of the people of Scripture was a precondition to any peace treaty with the Arabs, whose Bulgar envoys had arrived in Kiev after 985. A visitor to Atil wrote soon after the sacking of the city that its vineyards and garden had been razed, that not a grape or raisin remained in the land, and not even alms for the poor were available. An attempt to rebuild may have been undertaken, since Ibn Hawqal and al-Muqaddasi refer to it after that date, but by al-Biruni's time it was in ruins. Aftermath, impact, decline and dispersion. Although Polyak argued that the Khazar kingdom did not wholly succumb to Sviatoslav's campaign, but lingered on until 1224, when the Mongols invaded Rus, by most accounts, the Rus-Oghuz campaigns left Khazaria devastated, with perhaps many Khazarian Jews in flight, and leaving behind at best a minor rump state. It left little trace, except for some place names, and much of its population was undoubtedly absorbed in successor hordes. Al-Muqaddasi, writing ca. 985, mentions Khazar beyond the Caspian Sea as a district of woe and squalor, with honey, many sheep and Jews. Kedranos mentions a joint Rus-Byzantine attack on Khazaria in 1016, which defeated its ruler Georgius Sul. The name suggests Christian affiliations. The account concludes by saying that after Zul's defeat, the Khazar ruler of Upper Media, Sennacherib, had to sue for peace and submission. In 1024 Mstislav of Chernigov marched against his brother Yaroslav with an army that included Khazars and Kasachans in a repulsed attempt to restore a kind of Khazarian-type dominion over Kiev. Ibn al-Athir's mention of a raid of Fadlan the Kurd against the Khazars in 1030 CE, in which 10,000 of his men were vanquished by the latter, has been taken as a reference to such a Khazar remnant, but Barthold identified this Fadlan as Fatal ibn Muhammad and the Khazars as either Georgians or Abkhazians. A Kievan prince named Oleg, grandson of Yaroslav, was reportedly kidnapped by Khazars in 1079 and shipped off to Constantinople, although most scholars believe that this is a reference to the Cumans Kipchaks or other steppe peoples then dominant in the Pontic region. Upon his conquest of Mutarikhan in the 1080s, Oleg Sviatoslavich, son of a prince of Chernigov, gave himself the title Archon of Khazaria. In 1083 Oleg is said to have exacted revenge on the Khazars after his brother Roman was killed by their allies, the Polovtsi/Cumans. After one more conflict with these Polovtsi in 1106, the Khazars fade from history. By the 13th century they survived in Russian folklore only as Jewish heroes in the land of the Jews. By the end of the 12th century, Ptasha of Ratisbon reported traveling through what he called Khazaria, and had little to remark on other than describing its minim living amidst desolation and perpetual mourning. The reference seems to be to Karaites. The Franciscan missionary William of Rubruck likewise found only impoverished pastures in the lower Volga area where Ital once lay. Giovanni de Pien del Carpine, the papal legate to the court of the Mongol Khan Gayuk at that time, mentioned an otherwise unattested Jewish tribe, the Brutaki, perhaps in the Volga region. Although connections are made to the Khazars, the link is based merely on a common attribution of Judaism. The 10th century Zoroastrian Dinkart registered the collapse of Khazar power in attributing its eclipse to the enfeebling effects of false religion. The decline was contemporary to that suffered by the Transoxiana Samanid Empire to the east, both events paving the way for the rise of the Great Seljuk Empire, whose founding traditions mention Khazar connections. Whatever successor entity survived, it could no longer function as a bulwark against the pressure east and south of nomad expansions. By 1043, Kimyks and Kyipchaks, thrusting westwards, pressured the Oghuz, who in turn pushed the Pechenegs west towards Byzantium's Balkan provinces. Khazaria nonetheless left its mark on the rising states and some of their traditions and institutions. Much earlier, Tsitsak, the Khazar wife of Leo III, introduced into the Byzantine court the distinctive kaftan or riding habit of the nomadic Khazars, the Tsitsakshan, and this was adopted as a solemn element of imperial dress. The orderly hierarchical system of succession by scales to the Grand Principate of Kiev was arguably modeled on Khazar institutions, via the example of the Rus Khaganate. The Proto-Hungarian Pontic tribe, while perhaps threatening Khazaria as early as 839, practiced their institutional model, such as the dual rule of a ceremonial Kendkundu and a Gula administering practical and military administration, as tributaries of the Khazars. A dissident group of Khazars, the Kabars, joined the Hungarians in their migration westwards as they moved into Pannonia. Elements within the Hungarian population can be viewed as perpetuating Khazar traditions as a successor state. Byzantine sources refer to Hungary as Western Turkey in contrast to Khazaria, Eastern Turkey. The Gula line produced the kings of medieval Hungary through descent from Arpad, while the Kabars retained their traditions longer, and were known as Black Hungarians. Some archaeological evidence from Sarajevo suggests the Kabars practiced Judaism since warrior graves with Jewish symbols were found there, including menorahs, shofars, etrogs, lulavs, candle snuffers, ash collectors, inscriptions in Hebrew, and a six-pointed star identical to the Star of David. The Khazar state was not the only Jewish state to rise between the fall of the Second Temple and the establishment of Israel. A state in Yemen also adopted Judaism in the 4th century, lasting until the rise of Islam. The Khazar kingdom is said to have stimulated messianic aspirations for a return to Israel as early as Judah Halevi. In the time of the Egyptian vizier Alafdal Shahanshah, one Solomon ben Duji, often identified as a Khazarian Jew, attempted to advocate for a messianic effort for the liberation of, and return of all Jews to, Palestine. He wrote to many Jewish communities to enlist support. He eventually moved to Kurdistan where his son Menahem some decades later assumed the title of Messiah and, raising an army for this purpose, took the fortress of Ahmadiyya north of Mosul. His project was opposed by the rabbinical authorities and he was poisoned in his sleep. One theory maintains that the Star of David, until then a decorative motif or magical emblem, began to assume its national value in late Jewish tradition from its earlier symbolic use by Menahem. The word Khazar, as an ethnonym, was last used in the 13th century by a people in the North Caucasus believed to practice Judaism. The nature of a hypothetical Khazar diaspora, Jewish or otherwise, is disputed. Avraham ibn Daud mentions encountering rabbinical students descended from Khazars as far away as Toledo, Spain in the 1160s. Khazar communities persisted here and there. Many Khazar mercenaries served in the armies of the Islamic caliphates in other states. Documents from medieval Constantinople attest to a Khazar community mingled with the Jews of the suburb of Pera. Khazar merchants were active in both Constantinople and Alexandria in the 12th century.